You are listening to the Social Science KLAI-descope.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of the Social Science KLAI-descope with KLAI. I know this is a very long overdue episode, but finally back to wrap up 2021, wrap up the collection of 15 episodes, just basically do a huge wrap up in time for the holidays. If you haven't already, please be sure to follow the podcast on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Be sure to follow my socials on Instagram at KLAI-descope, Twitter at KMDLAI, or on LinkedIn. Be sure to rate 5 stars on Apple Podcasts if you so choose to. So yeah, I am finally back, and today we are going to be talking about one of my biggest accomplishments for 2021, and that is finally getting a paper published. And it took a long time to get there, but it is finally out. And I did mention this, I think, in episode 10, where I said that I had the paper that I was working on for the longest time was accepted for publication. Well, as of September 2021, it is finally out, and it is available to view on the website, behind a paywall, unfortunately, but I will also link a working paper that we've had that's basically the same thing if you wanted to go ahead and read the paper. So the paper is called Capital Controls in International Trade and Industry Financial Vulnerability Perspective, and this is a project with Professor Tao Wong from Swarthmore College and Swarthmore alumni David Hsu, class of 2018. So worked on it with both of them, and it is published in the Journal of International Money and Finance, the September 2021, volume 116. Just a couple quick notes about the journal. Since its launch in 1982, the Journal of International Money and Finance has built up a solid reputation as a high-quality scholarly journal devoted to theoretical and empirical research in the fields of international monetary economics, international finance, and the rapidly developing overlapping area between the two. Authors published in the journal are in the forefront of scholarly research on exchange rate behavior, foreign exchange options, international capital markets, international monetary and fiscal policy, international transmission, and other related questions. And yes, this is all from their website. I'm not tooting my own horn, but yes, it's honestly very exciting that we found a home for this project that we've been working on for, I would say, four years. So it's been a while. And so today I kind of want to talk about general gist, or the TLDR, of what the paper is about. I also want to talk about, hopefully, the more interesting bits of it, which is working on the paper, kind of my general experiences, things I've learned. Yeah. So what is this paper about? Well, the primary question we're trying to answer is, how do capital controls impact trade? And so for people that don't know what capital controls are simply controls that restrict movement of assets across borders. And so these types of policies or controls have impact across, I would say, two main channels, first of which is exchange rate, and the second one is cost of capital. The exchange rate channel, I would say, is the very commonly taught thing in either any international macro course or any international economics course. And the typical story for that is a country will impose capital controls on inflows, which result in currency depreciation or the prevention of currency appreciation. And this would lead to goods in that country to be cheaper relative to the rest of the world because the currency is depreciated. And that would help boost net exports, and boosting net exports means GDP goes up. So that's the general macro story behind the exchange rate piece. I never was really familiar with the cost of capital piece until I started working on this project, but basically that is just saying access to foreign capital becomes harder, which impacts financing, which impacts borrowing within a particular country. So those are the two main channels. And just thinking about those things, we're more focused on how capital controls impact trade differently across different industries with varying funding characteristics. And so industries can vary based on how reliant they are on external funding, which we call external finance dependence, or it can vary on the amount of capital the industry has to begin with, and we call that asset tangibility. And so the general results of the paper are we find that for exporter countries that tighten capital controls, industries that rely more heavily on external financing experience larger declines in exports, and industries that possess more tangible assets experience smaller declines in exports. And so what we mean by that is, let's say we take an industry such as professional and scientific equipment. That industry is very, very, very reliant on external financing. And so typically what would happen is it might need to borrow a lot of money, funding unclear, but it needs to borrow a lot of money in order to fund its production of this type of equipment such that it is ready to be exported. Now, if we impose capital controls, or if the country imposes capital controls on that, well, the borrowing might be much more difficult because maybe, let's say, they were trying to borrow from a foreign source, or they were borrowing from a pool that is from a foreign source. Well, that borrowing becomes a little bit more difficult. And because the borrowing is difficult, production might be slightly hampered. And so the production would go down, and then the amount they have ready to export might go down. So that's just kind of the first piece of the result. The second piece is more, let's say, like now we're talking about the food products industry. The food products industry is very self-sufficient. It has like the factory set up such that it is able to produce the food and then export it. Well, they are less reliant on borrowing, and so if a country were to impose capital controls, they might not be impacted as much because they already had the machinery, or they already had the funding necessary to produce and export. So that's kind of the second part of the result that we're looking at. Just the additional kind of tag on is that this pattern that we find is predominantly found in countries with low levels of financial development. And so we go through kind of the data sources that we use, the literature review, the empirical strategy that we use, and the results of the paper in terms of a magnitude. And that will all be linked in the description of the episode. So if you are interested, or you know someone that's interested, or you find some time or generally want to learn about this topic, feel free to go ahead and read the paper. So after the results, I kind of want to talk about the impact of this paper. In terms of this paper, I think it's one of the few that uses a really large data set to empirically understand how capital controls impact trade. And so the data that we're using is a bilateral trade data for 99 countries across 27 different industries from 1995 to 2015. And so you can imagine how big that is. That's 99 times 99 times 27 times 11. So this uses a large data set, but also our empirical approach is a synthesis of a lot of prior approaches done in the literature. We've probably gone through, I want to say, 4 or 5 papers, or 4 or 5 main papers that use various different empirical approaches, and we try to kind of neatly package it into one empirical approach, and it produced significant results. So moving on, I kind of want to talk about now my experiences working on the paper, some lessons I learned, maybe some funny stories that might have come about. And so I first got involved in the project, or I first heard about the project in 2017. This was the summer where I was a research analyst at the New York Fed, or I was a research intern, sorry, at the New York Fed. And David was a research assistant at Swarthmore. And I would visit Philadelphia pretty often. And one time I met up with him, and we were just catching up on the summer, basically talking about research, talking about things that we were working on, just, very collegiate econ nerds, just talking about stuff. And he mentioned this project that he was working on, which is the Capital Controls and Trade Project. And he was talking about getting the code and coding in data for the first time, working with data for the first time, accessing like these large data sets, um, reading literature, things like that. And then I was also doing the same thing. Like I was also learning Stata. I was learning some research best practices, not all. I was reading some random interesting papers. Yeah, we were just basically sharing information. And then I had my senior year in 2018. I finally took the International Economics Seminar taught by Professor Steve Golub in 2018. And I thought one of the more interesting units that we learned, or the more interesting weeks that we had, were the weeks with international macro, and specifically when we touched up on capital controls. And that was pretty interesting because typically like an intermediate macro course, typically it's usually about like a closed economy, and so we're only looking at a country and we're kind of disregarding trade for a very hot second. Like we know it exists, but kind of disregarding it for a lot of the theory that we learn in terms of macro. But in international economics, we've added that component back in, and so the determination of how open a country is in terms of capital flows is actually very important in macro. So adding that in terms of what I learned previously was very interesting, and yielded some pretty interesting results as well. And so that's how I first learned about capital controls. And then after I graduated, I went back to the New York Fed as a research analyst. I was working on some random, international economics topics and banking topics. And David reached out again saying that he wanted to pick up his capital control and trade project from 2017 back up, and asked if I wanted to work on it with him. And of course, I was like very eager and very excited. So I was like, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And I jumped into it without realizing how much work or how time consuming it would have been. So this project started in 2017 with David, but after a year of not doing it, naturally we forgot a lot of stuff. So like a lot of the literature that was read, a lot of the code, all of that stuff was kind of forgotten about. And so we spent a good month or 2 months kind of just picking those things back up and rereading the literature, creating like a Google Doc, summarizing all the papers, and highlighting which paper is really relevant to what we potentially want to look further into, which paper was not very relevant, sorting out folders and things like that, setting up a centralized like Google Drive in some sense to make sure that all our stuff was in sync. So yeah, we did a lot of that. In terms of coding, it was a very big undertaking. We were looking back at kind of the old code files, and a lot of it was just kind of some of it was like, why did we do this? We forgot about some of the cleaning steps, and yeah, so a lot of mess there as well. And so I spent a lot of time not only cleaning up the data, but also cleaning up the files, rewriting the code to make it more reproducible, and doing a lot of the checks with the data, because I think when we first initially put it together, there were a lot of errors. And so over time, we were just basically combing out all the errors and running a bunch of summary statistics, creating a bunch of graphs just to make sure the data is correct. So that was a big undertaking. And so once we had all that stuff taken care of, we also wanted to incorporate other data sources. And so the initial data source that we had was from, I think, Comtrade, which was the bilateral trade data. That was pretty messy. And so we got that cleaned out. And we also needed to incorporate new data sources, such as from Compustat, which kind of gave us all the industry indicators and things like that. World Bank, which is the country level data, and the CEPII, which is a list of like bilateral information, such as like trade distance or distance between countries, things like that. So that's basically what we had to pull together. And then once we had all the data cleaned out, once we had all the things merged properly, we had to come up with a regression. And so we were looking at the old regressions and the old regression results, and they looked very suspect. And so we basically went back and kind of gutted all of it and redid the regression specifications that we wanted to run and just brainstormed all that stuff again, and then finally ran them. And it took a while because the data set was so huge, but luckily we had resources to run those regressions and whatnot. So yeah, that overall took like maybe 5-6 months of work just to basically get everything back in order, prepare some results to look over, things like that. And this was all while we had our full-time jobs too. So this was not very glamorous, but eventually it got done, and it got to a point where the results that were coming back were consistent with across various different specifications we want to run, and they were fairly robust as well. So that was when we decided to actually start writing the paper. And so we started to write the paper with like an intro, the literature review, our empirical specification, the results that we have, maybe some like added application, and a conclusion. So we did all of that. We wrote the paper out, and then I think we had like a first draft of the paper, and then I was like browsing Twitter, and Claudia Som, which is a macroeconomist, she posted a blog post, or she posted something on Twitter based on like how to write a very good intro for an econ paper. I think at that time there were a lot of job market candidates that were trying to finish up their dissertations and finish up their papers and whatnot. So I read that blog post, and it was super, super helpful. And I showed David this. I was just like, look, like someone from the field had this, and I think it looks really good. And right now our intro doesn't really meet that. So we went back and we rewrote the entire intro. And because we rewrote the entire intro, we had to kind of go back and also rewrite the other sections of the paper as well. So that also took a long time to do, probably like, let's say like 2 months. Yeah, I think around 2 months, maybe 3 months. And so once we had like a working draft of the paper ready, it wasn't quite ready to submit yet, because so far a lot of the stuff that we were working on has been through our eyes and our lens, and a lot of it made sense to us but might not make sense to a research community, let's say. So we had to prepare presentations and present them in various different seminars such that we can, source feedback, make corrections to something we might have gotten wrong, and just revise the paper in general. And so luckily that summer, at this point it's like 2019, that summer we had 2 presentations lined up over the summer. One was at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, which is where David worked, and there were a lot of international macroeconomists that were there. And they listened to the paper, they gave their feedback. It was all really nice. And so yeah, that was the first presentation. Second presentation was actually at Swarthmore College, our alma mater, and we were presenting at their summer seminar series, I believe. Yeah, that was a very vivid experience that I had, mostly because I was presenting the paper at that time, and it was very nerve-wracking. Later, we had a presentation at the IMF, I think in 2020, but that was way later. And so once we got our feedback, we went back and we had to redo some specifications. We had to redo some of the regressions. We had to also incorporate some more kind of robustness checks. So basically run more regressions to make sure our initial results were okay. And so we reran all the results. We revised the paper with all the revisions to our analysis. And finally, we are ready to submit it. And this was probably at the end of 2019, I would say, like wintertime. And at that time, wintertime of 2019, both David and I were also preparing our applications for econ PhD programs for the fall of 2020. Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff to do then. We initially submitted it to I think the International Economic Review. I think it was like one of the large journals and immediately got desk rejected within a week. They were just like, yeah, this paper does not belong here, belongs somewhere else. Basically, they said it sucked. I mean, that's what I gathered. So we took the paper back and we kind of maybe tinkered with it a little bit more, and then we resubmitted it to the the Journal for International Money and Finance, which is where it lives right now. And yeah, we just submitted it, and basically we're just like, all right, let's hope that they don't desk reject us. And we waited like 2, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, even maybe even like over a course of a couple months as well. They never came back to us, so we're just like, oh, that must be good news, that it must be like taken seriously in some sense, and it might go through a revision process. So yeah, we were just waiting for that to happen, and the whole time, I mean, we were dealing with some other stuff like the aftermath of the our PhD applications and all that stuff. So yeah, that was basically kind of the life cycle up to that point. And then finally, randomly in 2021, I would say like February or something, I got an email from them saying that our paper was accepted, and a reviewer, I think there was like 1 or 2 reviewers that basically came up and said like, look, we had a couple of minor revisions we need you to do, but otherwise this paper is accepted. So yeah, it was very, very, very fortunate and very lucky to have had that come back as an acceptance. And so what we did was we went back and we revised a lot of the paper. We made sure the code was reproducible, and then we submitted all of it, and then it was ready for publication. And yeah, it comes September 2021, it is finally published. And so that overall journey took, I don't know, 5 years. Well, 5 years in total, maybe working on it for 4 years. Yeah, it was a really, 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 really long process, but I was really happy to have done it with people I enjoyed working with, such as David and Professor Tao Wong. They've been really, really supportive, and they've been just really good colleagues to work with in general. So there were 2 particular stories that I remember very clearly, and I don't think I'll ever forget. The first of which was during the process of working on the regressions and trying to make sure they made sense. There was a New York Fed holiday party. I think this was like winter 2018, like holiday season. And so I went to the holiday party. I was like, having fun, lots of fun, maybe drank a lot. And afterwards, I don't know what the deal was. Maybe it was the alcohol, maybe it was my motivation, maybe it was a combination of both, but I decided to go back and I wanted to run the regressions, and I wanted to make sure that they were ready to run. And so basically I went back to the office really drunk, and I was writing all the regressions, and I was just checking them out, and then I finally just pressed run. I was like, all right, this is gonna finish tomorrow. We're gonna have results, and I'm gonna send them to everyone, and it's gonna be great. And so I went home, and then I came back the next morning, luckily not hungover, but got to the office. I looked at the results, and something happened to them. Like, they were completely just, they didn't look right at all. It was like really weird. And so I went back and I checked the code, and I realized I made so many coding mistakes with regards to setting certain specifications, such as like setting fixed effects or setting clustering and things like that. Basically, I made a bunch of mistakes with the analysis, and basically that's just the moral of the story, is just don't run things, or don't create regressions to run when I'm drunk, I guess. So yeah, it was very embarrassing, so I had to go back and I had to change that, and basically wasted a day of doing that, which was very unfortunate, but that was just a really funny story. I think the second one was my first presentation ever in front of a bunch of economists. For those of y'all that don't know what it's like in an econ seminar room, sometimes it can be very, very, very brutal. In the sense that where the questions are asked are very somewhat thoughtful, but also very critical, and at times can completely derail a paper. And so like that's kind of that's kind of how intense that some of these seminars can get. So this was like my first seminar ever, my first presentation ever. I had my slide deck ready. I practiced in like the seminar room of the New York Fed like after hours to like a friend or two like the day before, just to make sure like I had everything. I had like Google documents of like a script basically to kind of collect my thoughts on. And even up until the presentation, I was like checking all the slides to make sure that they looked like correct and they were accurate. And so yeah, I was really nervous for this presentation. And then come time for the presentation itself to happen, I was up there, I was talking. There were a lot of like kind of surprise faces from professors because they all thought that Professor Tao Wong was presenting, but it was actually me. Surprise. And yeah, so at first it went fairly well, like going through kind of highlighting what our result was, highlighting what we're trying to understand relative to the literature, and kind of the data that we're using. Like I was all fairly comfortable with that, and so for the most part, that part went really well. It was only when we started talking about kind of the empirical methodology, such as like trying to explain the differences in differences regression that we were trying to run, explaining the results in terms of magnitude. That was when things got a little bit out of my control in some sense, and so I'm pretty sure like I kind of blacked out during that point because I honestly do not remember what I was saying. I do not remember what I answered, how I answered, what I said, and at points I think my heart was pounding so fast that like I was just like, yeah, these are our results, and I didn't really say much after that. So yeah, I was very nervous for that portion, but luckily I had the slides already there. So in terms of interpreting the results, like it was all written on the slides, so I just basically had to not read off of it, but present that part. And so that wasn't terrible. And finally, once everything concluded, we just like wrapped up the results and everything. And then after that, I just had a huge sigh of relief. Like that was very nerve wracking. And yeah, it was like a really well attended seminar too. Like a lot of people were interested. There were a lot of economists there asking questions, albeit some of them were irrelevant, but they were all asking really tough questions. And I think for the most part, we got out of it okay. Professor Tao Wong was there in the audience to also somewhat help answer questions, and along with David as well. So thankfully, both of them were there. But yeah, that was a pretty nerve wracking experience. But overall, I think it ended up being all right, and I will always remember after that presentation, Professor Golub and Professor Mark Huberberg, they both came up to me and they were like, that was a really good presentation. Like, we were very excited for it to be potentially published. And at that point, we weren't even thinking about publication. We were just like, oh, thank God we had like a draft of the paper. But yeah, both of them were like, yeah, we're looking forward to see it published in some journal. And that was really encouraging. And, I'm very thankful for all their comments and for them attending and their support. But yeah, that was just one particular experience. And I know that in the future, like if this were to be my career, like I would have to be doing this over and over again. But at least for my first presentation, I'm happy it was at Swarthmore College, and I'm happy I didn't completely lose my mind. So yeah, those were some two interesting stories that I don't think I'll ever forget with related to working on this paper. In general, I would say like overall, like this might seem kind of overblown because if this were to be my career, if I were to be an economist going forward, like I would probably have to do this, I don't know, 2 or 3 times more per year. I don't know, even maybe more than that, like juggle 6 or 7 projects. So doing this like 6 or 7 times. And so really for me, like this was such a good introduction in terms of starting a project from beginning to end and just having, just living through it. I think that was very valuable and a very good experience that I really wanted to share with everyone who either might be considering pursuing like a research career or who are just starting off in their research journey, like things like that. So hopefully a lot of the story and a lot of the research and stuff like that were helpful to everyone. I think moving forward, I don't know if there's going to be any more extensions from this paper. I think David and I have talked about maybe doing another project that's based on this paper, but we haven't really even worked on it that much yet. So maybe more to come, maybe not. We'll see. But I'm just so happy. Again, I'm just so happy to have experienced this research process, and yeah, always a consideration for a career option. Anyways, that's all I have for today in terms of today's episode. Once again, thank you all so much for listening to this podcast. And if there's anything, if you all have any questions or y'all want to discuss the paper that we wrote or anything else at all, please feel free to reach out to my socials. DMs will be open for that kind of stuff. Anyways, that's all I have for now. Everyone, hope you all have a happy holidays. And yeah, maybe I will see you all in 2022. Bye bye.